This is a Renew original recording. Hello and welcome to Believe in People, a British podcast award-winning series about all things addiction, recovery and stigma. My name is Matthew Butler and I'm your host, or as I like to say, your facilitator. In this episode, I'm joined by Woody Albrow, who shares his compelling story of addiction, recovery and transformation. From early substance use in his teens, beginning with butane gas and progressing through cannabis, hallucinogens and MDMA, Woody eventually found himself gripped by alcohol dependency. Despite once dismissing alcohol as rudimentary, it became the substance that brought him to his lowest point, affecting his health, relationships and sense of self. A turning point came after a drink driving arrest and a deep period of isolation. Reconnecting with his father and entering detox marked the beginning of meaningful recovery, with spirituality becoming a central pillar in maintaining abstinence. Woody speaks candidly about the importance of lived experience and the tension between professional identity and personal history in the treatment field. Now National Connecting Communities Lead at Change Grow Live, Woody champions the role of community, connection and purpose in long-term recovery. His journey, from volunteer to national leader, highlights the power of authenticity and the need to reduce stigma in both services and society. I start my conversation today with Woody by diving straight in at the deep end and exploring where his addiction started.
It's an interesting one because on the way over here, I was obviously thinking about the questions you'd be asking, and I wasn't sure. And obviously, addiction is a big part of my life. And I was thinking about when I started noticing sort of behaviour which you could call addictive, and for me, it happened very early on. It was probably the age of sort of 13. I was using butane gas as a means to sort of numb myself. And it's funny because when I reflect back on that, I was thinking, I just think that's so incredibly dangerous. But for me at the time, it was a sort of a normal thing. It's quite scary. I find it sort of like, oh my God, I was doing butane gas and it was like, and it's funny because I don't sort of relate it to as being abnormal, but only when I'm reflecting on it. I just see that as having children myself, and the thought of them doing something like that would be sort of horrific. So I had a long sort of period in my early years of sort of numbing myself, and butane gas was one of them. And then it was cannabis for many years. Cannabis was the thing that was the sort of staple thing which I did. Alcohol, not so much. Alcohol was always sort of seen as a bit crude and a bit sort of like, I used to be sick a lot on alcohol. So alcohol was in the background. But and then it turned into, I grew up in Cardiff, and Cardiff is... living in Cardiff had access to magic mushrooms. So psilocybin was sort of like you could go up to the valleys and pick magic mushrooms. So I had a lot of time using magic mushrooms and sort of going into a different reality.
I think the interesting part there is out of all those things, the one that is the most socially acceptable is alcohol. Yet you, in your experience, found that to be the one that was quite crude. What was the reason for it then? I guess looking back at your own childhood, you talked about numbing yourself and that escapism that comes with that. What was the reason for wanting to have that feeling?
And I think that's a really difficult one to answer, because I mean there was various things going on at home, but nothing which I'd sort of
considered to be a trauma or something.
Well, I think there was stuff going on which, and I think I suppose trauma is so personal, isn't it? I think everyone's experience, but I didn't. Looking back, I didn't really have the means to manage my emotions, so what I used to do is I used to get really angry. I'd get really angry. It was just frustration. My mum and dad split up, and at the time that was just, and my mum moved out, and there was a lot of was a lot of shame attached to that. So my generation, there was a lot of men left the house, but not many women.
Yeah.
So there was there was something about that. And I remember never telling anyone about it, never telling any of my friends. And people used to come around the house and go, "Where's your mum?" And it'd be like, she's out, you know. There were certain things which I just didn't deal with. I didn't have the means to sort of like talk about them. So I think what I did was sort of those feelings. I relieved those feelings of frustration and anger through other substances, and it was, my environment was a lot of people who were doing these things. You know, sort of gas. You know, there was sort of things like a lot of people were doing glue, sniffing glue, and a lot of people were dying. But I was I prided myself in of not sniffing glue, you know, because that was a bit dirty.
Yeah, it's almost a moral high ground sort of thing. Like, it's not as bad as that.
Absolutely. The hierarchy of sort of like, we're not glue sniffers.
Yeah.
Glue sniffers look really messy and you get it all over your stuff. And sort of like, there was a bit more slick with a sort of can of butane gas. But, so there was things going on. But I had a relatively good upbringing. Do you know what I mean? I had, but I still had this sense of not feeling sort of able in myself to express myself in a way, and I would internalize all these things, and drugs became the means to sort of to cope with sort of life, you know, and it was effective for many years.
Where did it move to then? You talk about obviously that going to the cannabis and stuff. Where did that eventually go?
Well, so I talk when I sort of reflect, I talk about sort of me having sort of two rock bottoms when in my life, and one was very early on, and one was when I was about 17. I got to the stage where I was tripping most days for a period of about a year, and I got incredibly unwell. Basically, I left home when I was 16. I think the day after my birthday, I managed to leave, and at that age, it was me and my mates could manage to get some housing benefit, rent a house, or move in. And we were like freedom, you know, party. I had no idea, you know, I had no idea about what you needed to do to live. It was like sort of 24-hour party, 24-hour tripping, 24-hour just getting off your face. And it was fun at the beginning, you know, but after the year sort of took its course, I got very unwell. I was like malnourished. I was incredibly thin. I weighed about 7 stone. I wasn't really eating. We were sort of stealing pints of milk from the street to sort of like have any sort of anything to eat. We were just there was no sort of, there was no healthy living involved in it. It was just excess, and it was just partying, and the wheels fell off. And I remember my mum coming to visit me, and she was just like horrified how I looked, what I was doing, and I was just. And she said, "You come and live with me." She was at the time living in Forest of Dean, in this, you know, in the forest, which was sort of somewhere which, for me, enabled me to have this sort of period of recovery and a period of sort of removing me from the sort of chaos I was in.
Did that bring up any resentment to have your mother leave the family home, and then here you are, you know, living this less than desirable lifestyle, and for her to then say, "Oh, come live with me"?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I had a long period where I didn't speak to my mother. You know, I took it all out on her. You know, part of the sort of thing, I was very stubborn. I was a very stubborn kid. I sort of like, I would shut people out. So, yeah, absolutely, there was resentment. But you know, what was funny is she reached out to me when I really needed her, and it enabled us to start a really fantastic relationship, and I still have a fantastic relationship with my mother from that. That she really helped me when I needed, and I could understand. I think at 13, 14, you don't really understand the complexities of a relationship, you know, and you know, so I got a lot more understanding of that, and I think we restarted a relationship on a much more sort of open sort of terms. It wasn't so sort of, it was different, and it was really appreciated. Yeah.
How did you find that your addiction impacted the people that was around you? And can you kind of give a bit of an insight into that as well? We always say no one goes into addiction alone. I think so many people kind of underestimate the impact that addiction can have on others. I guess that's kind of what we're trying to explore, is how does it affect those that are around you?
No, absolutely. No, and there's a lot, you know, as soon as you say that, you know, I can feel that sort of pit in my stomach sort of going, you know, oh my God, you know, because I know I affected a lot of my family. I mean, so I talk about, you know, I just spoke about that period of time when I was very young, and I had limited impact. I mean, I had huge impact. It impacted my family so much, but the real impact was when much later in my life I was sort of cocaine dependent and then alcohol dependent, and that period of time I was in a relationship. I had 2 children, and that basically just everything fell apart because of that behaviour. So I lost a relationship. I was unable to see my children for over a year. Nobody really wanted to be around me because I was just not a nice person. You know, I suppose in the sense of it, it was like the addiction became so powerful that all the obsession of just drinking to oblivion was so great that everything else just went out the window. So that was my priority. It was just to get out of it. And it was just a really scary, dark period. So the people around me suffered incredibly, you know, and I, you know, and that's, you know, I sort of live with that feeling of, you know, I try and turn it around to sort of, you know, how I live my life now. But absolutely, I really impacted my relationship to everyone.
Thinking about when you're in that, because we see it a lot in services, you know, people using substances where from a third person perspective, it looks like they have, I guess, a complete disregard, or they just don't care about how it's impacting others. When you're going through that, when you was at the heights of cocaine and alcohol addiction, and you're not able to see your children, and be honest in this, are you thinking about them? Are you thinking about, or are you really just focusing on yourself and your own individual needs? Because I found that when people achieve recovery, you can say, "Oh God, I was so selfish." In hindsight, what was I doing? But in that time, did you even care? Is what I'm asking for. And I get that's the truth. Do you care, or is it just about you and your own needs and your own addictions?
It's an interesting one, because I think, like you said, I think there's a lot of stigma around it as sort of like that uncaring behaviour, and I think it is complex, because I think anyone who would say this obsession is so great that you don't have the ability to behave in a way of showing that care, but deep down you're ripped apart by knowing what the right thing to do is, but not being able to do it. Do you know what I mean? And I think that is the real wrench, the real sort of that's sort of where the pain is in addiction, because I think the ability to act in the right way is just sort of taken away from you because of the addiction. And I think that's not, I don't think that's avoiding responsibility, but I think there's just an inability to be responsible when you're in addiction.
Yeah.
Because, I always, I managed to stop addictive drugs. Ecstasy was a big part of it. I managed to stop that. Cocaine, incredibly addictive, but I managed to stop that. The one I needed help with and to go into a detox unit and rehab was alcohol. Alcohol was just brought me completely to my knees, and that took everything away. And that was just, I had no idea of the obsession of physically and mentally obsessed with just getting that drink. The only time you could sort of relax was when you had enough drink to actually pass out. And it's just a hideous state. So I think it's almost like impossible to do responsible things when you're in addiction. It's very difficult, you know what I mean? And I think there's different degrees, I think there's sort of like levels of addiction, A lot of people can have sort of mild addictions and manage to sort of do things. But I think where it took me was a point for quite a long time where I couldn't function normally, and I couldn't hold my responsibilities, and I lost everything as a result. There's a lot of sadness and regret about that, but there's also a sort of an acknowledgement that is part of my life, and that is part of who I am now. I see a lot of the impetus for who I am now comes from that. It's what they say is that pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth. It's a key part of my growth is having endured that pain and that experience.
It's interesting to look at, starting using substances at such a young age, and I guess going from gas into cannabis to hallucinate drugs like mushrooms to cannabis to MDMA to alcohol. I guess it's almost like the definition of madness is repeating the same behaviours but with different substances. Was it kind of like a ladder of progression where you move from one thing to the other, or was it just almost like a cocktail of all these things was happening at once?
It's an interesting one. I think there was subtle things which I suppose attracted me to a certain thing. I think hallucinogenics was just incredible. You know what I mean? It was just that experience was so attractive, and I suppose this is, growing up in the 80s, there was a lot of sort of
cultural influences,
things. I used to just love sort of watching Song Remains the Same, sort of Led Zeppelin videos, and, Jimi Hendrix, who's like my brothers were into all of that. It was sort of there was a romantic sort of element of that. And I think generational sort of things like, the club scenes, ecstasy and, all of that was the thing which was sort of going on. So I think there's sort of, I keyed into certain trends, I suppose, but and I think there were certain things which were available at different times. So I don't know really what. It didn't feel like I was going for something harder. It was something different. Yeah.
Because I think going through, again, as you said quite early on, going to move with your mother after experiencing this, it almost sounds like, right, I've got over this thing and then doing something else. And again, going back to the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And that's kind of what it sounded like at first. It's like, right, well, I've got off this, but now I'm going to move on to this. Got off this, now I'm going to move on to this. But alcohol is the thing that, again, as you said, has brought you to your knees. And it's interesting because the first thing you said in this podcast when you was very young was alcohol seemed quite crude. Do you know what I mean?
Okay.
And that was the thing that got you in the end. Yeah.
And I meet lots of people who have that similar experience. Is that sort of, you know, and for that reason, I think they don't identify alcohol as being a problem, because it was always a bit like. And I remember in detox, I same sort of similar thing to cannabis. I'd left a bit of hash at home, and it was like, oh, you know, at least I'll come back to that after I've detoxed. You know, I'll have a bit of that. And then in treatment, it was like someone said, you know, do you think that's a good idea? You know what I mean? And it was like, what? It's just cannabis. You know what I mean? It's just like, and that's the same with alcohol. I think a lot of people I know sort of put down, you know, the heavier drugs, but leave the alcohol. And then if things aren't addressed, you know, the alcohol can become the problem. And I think it is hideous. You know, I mean, alcohol dependency and all that it brings is just a sort of, it's just such a horrible experience. And I think people don't really get that. You know, I think generally people just, you know, treat it as a decision, you know, a choice.
And I think it goes back to, you know, we're all wired very differently, but like I myself, I can drink and I can stop. And I think that's the thing with alcohol. The reason why people don't understand alcoholism is because not everyone has used heroin. Not everyone has used MDMA, hallucinogenic, you know, drugs like mushrooms. I would say 99% of the people I will ever talk to at some point have drank alcohol in their life and have stopped drinking alcohol. Yeah. So when they see someone with an alcohol dependency, they was like, well, it didn't affect me that way. I never got addicted, so therefore it can't possibly be an addictive substance. And that's where the lack of understanding comes in. Whereas for me, someone who's never used mushrooms, for instance, I would be like, oh, well, maybe it is an addictive substance because I've never used it. Yeah. So I can only hypothesize how it might make me feel or what it could do. But everyone... Again, 99% of people have used alcohol in some way, so they look at the addiction and go, well, it's not that addictive because it never affected me in that way, because they've got that direct experience of it. You went to detox for alcohol. Was there a moment, or was there a series of events that led up to that moment and thought, right, I need to nip this in the bud now, I need to get clean?
Yeah.
You said about you've had a couple of rock bottom moments. Was this one of them, I guess?
No, absolutely, absolutely. My second rock bottom was basically I got arrested for drink driving. You know, which I'm incredibly ashamed at the time, and still, you know, element of shame around it. I mean, I got arrested and I was alcohol dependent. So, you know, no part of my day I was sober. You know, it was just from every waking hour I was drinking, you know. So I was arrested, put in the cells, and then told to come back to, you know, a hearing. And I just didn't turn up. I couldn't. I was sort of barricaded into a sort of basement room in my flat, just paranoid, just sort of surrounded by just cans and debris, and just sort of like, you know, it was just hell. It was a hole. It was like, you know, curtains closed. I was just, you know, every knock at the door, it was like, you know, and then the fear of the police are coming, until one day they did, and they broke down the door, which it was like, seemed like a bit excessive. But, you know what I mean? It was like sort of, you know, a thing. And I laugh now, but, you know, at the time it was just hell. But, you know, it was the time of sort of paranoid that someone's going to knock on the door. And then it's like there was about 3 vans, 2 cars, there was about 12 police, all in sort of gear, barricade, you know, smashing the door down, coming in, arresting me, you know, dragging me out. The whole street was out. The shame was just like... But what came out of that, it was a neighbour actually phoned my ex and said, you know, Woody's just been arrested. He's been taken away. So my ex contacted my dad, and then my dad found out where I was. And then I was held in the cells overnight and taken to court in the morning. And when I was appeared in court, I looked over and I saw my dad, who I hadn't seen for a long time. And and then it was like the game's up. You know, it was like, I need help. This is sort of like apparent, you know, because the denial before and just, you know, so then it just felt like actually I do need some help. And he was incredible, you know. He sort of, you know, he listened to me and he helped me, he supported me. And I was very ill at the time as well because I'm type 1 diabetic. So, you know, alcohol and diabetes are really not a good mix, you know, and alcohol dependency. So I was very ill. I was very thin. I was very just, hideous time. And he was able to help me, and he was, and then in some way, by being so ill, it enabled me to sort of fast track into a detox, you know, and get the help I needed. And that was just, it was a sort of, you know, the cliche. It was the sort of start of my new life. It was a sort of, you know, it was a time where I'd sort of really realised that I can't just keep on doing this stuff. You know, I need to sort of do a 180 turnaround, and I need to sort of have a new way. And something I haven't mentioned, but which is key in my story, is the sort of, it's a spiritual aspect, and it's sort of part of my philosophy of thinking of connecting to a higher power, or I like to call it a higher power, or God's spiritual sort of view, is that if I am connected to my higher power or a higher power, I'm less likely to do things that will blur that connection. Do you know what I mean? And I think that connection for me creates a sort of, I suppose, makes me adhere to certain values, values of sort of doing the next right thing, being a good person, being kind, being, things which are sort of, I feel most people know internally what is right.
A moral compass of what's right and what's wrong. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So I attribute that in a sense to a spiritual, a higher power, and that allows me, that feeling of sort of, if I take a drink or a drug, I blur that connection, and therefore I'm likely to, go off the path. And kind of follow the moral compass in which you would normally follow. Yeah, because you're not yourself, are you, when you're under the influence of substances? You act in a way that can be very unlike you, and so forth. Yeah, and for me, that's a sort of, I suppose, because I've had that twice in my life, in a sense of sort of, going to that rock bottom, that jumping off place, and sort of, coming back from it. For me, I need to stay plugged in, and that allows me to have a good life, So it's sort of, so why go back there? So that's why, for me personally, abstinence is the way I do that. And it's a sort of a personal choice that I don't. Why would I jeopardize that by picking up any drink or drug?
Well, was it quite easy to kind of follow, or I guess accept the possibility of a higher power? Because I think when some people, especially when I'm talking early recovery here, now I imagine it's a lot easier. But early recovery, when you first start introducing those concepts to people, it can either be rejected or just, oh, that sounds like a lot of bollocks sort of thing. Like,
yeah.
And, some people really need convincing. Now, I've seen people who, I've seen people looking like they're on death's door and eventually, come round and are now doing really good things with their life after achieving recovery. Was the notion of a higher power a hard sell to you, or was it something where when you heard it you went, fuck, that makes sense? Like, how was that in those early days?
So when I was at my sort of first rock bottom, when I was about 15, 16, I met this guy who was equally a sort of a hedonist, He was a fantastic character. First time I met him was at Clapham Common. There was an anti-apartheid demonstration, and he was doing a bucket in one of the ponds in Clapham Common, and there was like thousands of police around. He was just a maverick. He was just like someone there, extreme hedonist, and he was like, "Come on, yeah, it's all right, have a bit of this," and it was drink, and it was like. And we had a fantastic time, and he was a real charismatic character. But what happened with him, he found God, he found a spiritual path, he found something, and he stopped all of that. And that was really attractive to me at that age, coming up to about 17 or after I'd had this rock bottom. We spent a lot of time together, and he introduced me to that philosophy of basically if you take a drink or a drug, you'll blur this connection, but with this connection you've got something which will allow you to have a good life and not need, because the thought of, I think if you've experienced sort of addiction, when you're in addiction, the fear you have of not having that substance to prop up your life, to give you the skills, because it becomes something that you have to have all the time. Do you know what I mean? I needed something in my pocket if it was
as a just in case sort of thing. Yeah,
it's there.
It's a comfort blanket, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Just
I'd always be tapping my pocket just to see if it's there.
So I do that with my house keys, but it's a completely different kettle of fish, isn't it? With a bag of cocaine. Yeah.
Is it there? Is it all right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. So, so. Being able to replace that with a sort of philosophy of and a belief of, the higher power can sort of take that place was just sort of incredibly attractive. And I experienced that. So when I'd stopped and when I was recovering in the forest and I was seeing my friend, it was like we did a bit of a sort of medley of spiritual things and there was a lot of sort of Eastern tradition. There was a lot of sort of Hinduism and a lot of sort of Krishna stuff. There was a lot of Buddhism, and it was all very attractive and eclectic, and but it kept me sober. It kept me sort of away from everything else. But life happened, and I forgot about that in a sense of. And my friend, who was very influential, he was someone I actually he was a musician, and I joined a band with him. And one day he said to me, we've got an exemption. We can smoke a bit of weed. It's all right. We can keep the connection and smoke a bit of weed.
Like a get out of jail free card almost.
It was a bit like, yeah. And that started a sort of slippery slope.
Because once you make an exception for one thing, it's it
it
opens the floodgates, doesn't it? In some respects.
And that's exactly what happened. And then it just sort of like slowly, it just became everything else, and that was the norm. And it was so. I think the second time around of when I was at that point, and when I realised I lost things, and then I discovered that there's a whole sort of, there's a medley of peer support out there which you can sort of access, that people can access, and know that actually there's a lot of other people who connect to a higher power and allow that to be their thing.
Did you feel quite isolated until you met those people? Was it kind of, did you feel like this was your own thing, and then it was quite, oh wow, other people are experiencing similar things to me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the recovery community to me is key in that. It's like most of the people, most of my friends, most of the people who are in recovery I know, it's like and as you know, I work for Change Grow Live. Change Grow Live played a huge part in my journey from coming through the door of services, almost 15 years ago to working here. And the people I've met and it's that those social connections of being able to be open and honest with people it's been massive. And I think it's a key part is finding your tribe, isn't it? It's finding those people you can actually sort of relate to.
And you started as a volunteer with Change Grow Live, didn't you, as a peer mentor?
Yeah. So I sort of came after treatment. I came out, and it was like aftercare was with CGL, and it was just it was fantastic because I was offered the peer mentoring program. I did the peer mentoring program in Southwark, and a shout out to Phil Roy. Phil Roy was the peer mentor lead at the time, and he was just such a charismatic character. And he really sort of ingrained sort of structure in my life about sort of what I needed to do, and it was some really sort of basic stuff, but it gave me the framework to sort of like have a decent life and sort of, so by doing the peer mentoring course, by being, by going to lots of peer support meetings and, sort of immersing myself in that world, I'd sort of, slowly things started to come back,
What inspired you to move into volunteering? Because I think one of the things that I found as the volunteer lead myself, I see it a lot.
Yeah.
And I think one of the misconceptions that I sometimes see as a volunteer lead, and I had a really good conversation on this series about it before, but the misconception that by volunteering or working in recovery services, that in itself is recovery. And I think sometimes people think, oh, wow, I've cracked it now because I'm in a peer support role.
Yeah.
Was there something that, I guess, disregarded that, but was there something that inspired you to join the organisation, to do what you did?
No, absolutely. I'd always, I suppose, I love people. I'm curious. I've sort of like have a sort of, I joke about with my partner, sort of saying about I'm a sort of connection addict. If I don't get a connection with someone in a day, I feel a bit sort of, pissed off. It's just that element of sort of like meaningful contact,
conversations.
Yeah. So I suppose it became attractive, and because what I did, I was a landscape gardener prior to this, so it was sort of. And another key thing for me is nature. Nature is just a real, it's really important to.
I kind of made that. It's interesting because I made that assumption about nature being important to you when you said you started using hallucinogenic drugs. It's funny how I already made that connection before you'd even mentioned it. Like, quite a stereotypical view, but it's often the case with people like hallucinogenic drugs are very big on nature,
absolutely.
aren't they?
Yeah. No, I've definitely got a sort of hippie in me. There's that element of sort of. Yeah, gardening has been fantastic. It's a big part of my life is nature. And I feel that, in a sense of a sort of a spiritual connection, I feel most at ease in nature. Sorry,
No, so that was me. I threw you off there. I guess so. I was just talking about the inspirations of becoming a volunteer. I guess a connection, obviously, being an important thing.
Yeah, no, hugely. So just the notion of being that one's own experience can help others. Is massive. Yeah. And I think there is a difference in terms of the. Because I agree what you said earlier about the, it working in services isn't sort of recovery. It is different, but I think I think it's a good thing to do. it's a good thing to do to help others. You know? So it became a sort of means to me to help others. And I think in the early days it was around, you know, peer support, because it was a peer mentor. As a peer mentor, you know, your name tag says you're a peer, and you can be, you know, the whole notion of greeting people and sitting alongside people and to say to them, I've been where you've been, is hugely supportive.
Yeah.
And what is interesting, and it's something that I've, at the moment, it's very sort of strong in me, is the feeling of how we should use people's lived experience within organisations to be able to help others, because there is this, I think culturally we have this thing of when you come into services as someone with lived experience, you share that, but to progress professionally, you somehow have to hide away from that and become professional, and it's it's about them, it's not about you, and it's about, you know, and I think, you know, one of the key things of being asked to do this podcast and coming on is that actually I had to look at myself and go, actually, you know, I'm talking about how we need to address stigma, but why did it take me years and years to be able to disclose within an organisation about my own lived experience?
Yeah, because I never knew. So I've known you a while now, probably at least 5-6 years. I only recently found out you use lived experience when I think Robbie had met you, and Robbie said, "Oh, Woody's going to come on the podcast." I was like, "All right, what's he going to talk about?" I was like, "His experience." I was like, "Is he lived experience?" I was like, "Yeah." I was like, I've got, and I had no idea. So it goes to show that it's only something that you recently, vocalising, I guess.
Yeah, so I think I was quite good at masking it in a sense of, you know, and it was always encouraged. So you don't sort of work in your own area, you move about. So I moved about a lot of London services, and every time I moved I sort of would put on a professional hat, because there was a sort of desire to be professional, and it felt like, you know, if I was to disclose, I would be treated differently, and I think that's societal stigma.
When you say differently, do you mean, I guess, is there negatively? Do you feel like you'd be treated negatively especially by colleagues in the service? Do you think that would have been a thing, or? And
it's funny because I think societal stigma is so pervasive. It comes in everywhere. Yeah. You know, through every little gap, it sort of manages to find a way in. And I think sometimes we're not that conscious of it, you know, and you can. And so I think it's a personal decision, because I wouldn't want to be critical to say that the system doesn't allow you, but I think there is something about how, I suppose for me it's a personal thing of how I'm going to be judged. You know, and I think, and I'm really happy that things are changing. I think things are changing in order to sort of like understand someone with lived experience has a skill set, has an asset, has something which is of value, which can be shared, you know, and especially within this field, you know, I think but I'm also very conscious of this sort of creating divisions between people with lived experience and people without, because I think, you know, there's amazing people who've got naturally a lot of empathy and work with people in a really incredible way. Yeah. You know,
I found as a volunteer lead, one of the things that I often found coming across people with lived experiences, only an addict can help another addict. That often is the starting block. And then you find the more I work with people, someone who, you know, isn't, I wouldn't label myself as an addict, the amount of help I can bring to somebody, and it's like, oh wow, you know, it kind of changes that perception. But absolutely. I completely understand with what you're saying about the divide of people with lived experience and people without, because it sometimes does come with that only we can help, only we truly understand. And the one thing that, especially when having those conversations with service users of, oh, you don't get it, you've never been where I've been. And my response is, I've never been hit by a bus either, but I know it would hurt. And it's like, there's a little moment, I'm like, I understand that what you're going through is painful. And I think because of stigma, there is an element of, look, the reality is, a lot of the public do not give a fuck about someone with addiction problems. They don't care about the homeless person. It's just something they accept. It's something there. I often say, as long as someone has those values, truly has those values of being bold, being open and being compassionate, someone who is empathetic and willing to help, that is enough
Absolutely.
to help someone with addiction, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And I think I think there is a unifying element of, we're human and we all suffer pain.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So pain is the sort of like the bit which we can recognise. And I think you can see it in people's eyes where you sort of understand that they've got an insight, they've got an insight into the impact of pain. And I think when you don't have to have been homeless to understand how that must feel in a sense. So,
I think there's something in there of, if I think of what it would take for me to be street homeless, it would mean I would have had to have lost everything. And even just thinking about the possibility of losing everything makes me understand and be empathetic towards someone's situation when they're street homeless. Because I often think, if everything went wrong with my mortgage, my wife, my dad would put me up, my mum would put me up, I'd have a friend that would put me up.
Yeah.
If something had happened in my life where all those things wasn't there to help me, then God only knows what it's like to be street homeless.
Yeah.
And even just thinking about all that stuff and being in that position is enough to make me think, fuck this, what a shit situation to be in. Do you know?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I think what's really critical is the ability to connect with someone. I think when you're in that position of real sort of crisis and someone gives you time, someone actually sort of is able to sort of listen to you, truly listen, that is hugely therapeutic. And I think, obviously someone who's had similar experience or something, that connection can be really strong. And I think that is the basis of the, why the recovery community is so strong. We're survivors, that element of you've been to that place where it is just very dark and you've actually managed to sort of come back from it is there's a unifying feeling of, camaraderie, which is so powerful. But like I said, it's not exclusive to recovery community. And I think there's a lot of, really good people within services who provide excellent care, and allow people to really, change their lives, and get the support they need.
Absolutely. And I guess looking at the challenges of lived experience roles, I mean, you've gone from a volunteer and a peer mentor to a national lead role, and it's something that I like to share with volunteers when they are doing their training, is how far you can go in this organisation. I don't know about your educational background. I don't know if you've got degrees or things like that. I mean, I'm educated to a degree level in nothing related to really what I do now, but I talk about experience being the most important thing. What are some of the challenges that you faced, I guess, going from transitioning from a peer mentor into leadership roles? What are some of the most profound challenges faced by individuals with that lived experience in professional roles, and how can organisations like Change Grow Live support them better?
I think it's really interesting, because I think there is an element of I wasn't using my lived experience as a way to progress. It was about, I wanted to have the skills. I wanted to have the skill set to be able to do the good job, because I think that's also the thing. Just because you lived experience doesn't mean you're any good at.
There's a lot of other qualities that you need to be in a leadership role, isn't there? Absolutely,
absolutely. So I feel. So I think it is taking people on their merits, and that's key. And I think that sort of person-centered approach to see what you bring. And I feel that, part of it has been, in my latest role as becoming National Connecting Communities Lead, I was able to sort of sort of talk about my own lived experience to being an asset, and I think that really helped. And I was judged on that as a merit or having insight, and I think that has obviously affected the way I view the world. So I feel I think the organisation has really helped me. And there's been training all the way, but I think I still feel that there's an aspect of societal stigma which comes into the organisation around sort of seeing people with lived experience as having assets rather than risks.
Yeah,
and I think I think that's easy to say in some respect, because I think there are challenges. Because I think, in my early days, there were things which were triggers and risks and attached to it as sort of which you have to be aware of.
Yeah,
and I think you want to safeguard against those.
Of course, yeah.
But I think. I think there's various ways that we can address it. And I think this podcast is fantastic. And I think that, the ability to get the voices of people. And like you said, you didn't know I had lived experience. And I think I'm probably boring people now, because every time I do I'm in the workspace, I sort of tell them, go on, say something. You know what I mean? But it comes out naturally, because I feel it's part of one's sort of authenticity, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you say about boring people by talking about your own experience. I think if you didn't, it's almost like you say, it's almost denial of it. In some way, I think there's something there in sharing those stories, and I'm not saying you're not proud of it, but being proud of it and adding those contributions. Because I guess my question to you is, do you think the organisation does celebrate people with lived experience enough as part of their staff? Because I think there are rules around, you shouldn't disclose, and you should, keep that part to yourself. Do you think it could be celebrated more?
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's, I think so, absolutely. I think it's, I think culturally it's changed. I think the new drug strategy is fantastic. Lived
experience is such a big part of it, isn't it?
Huge. And I think Dame Carol Black's sort of review, was bang on, to seeing it as a health condition rather than something we need to punish has shifted things. And I think, mine and Helen's, my work wife, as she calls me, a work husband. So I'm happy to say that. Are doing a lot of work around lived experience recovery organisations, LEROs, and the importance of them. And we're getting commissioners all the time, sort of going, "We need a LERO. We need a LERO. What do we do? What do we do?" And it's sort of it's a cultural shift. It's sort of trying to sort of understand. There is an understanding of the values of what lived experience groups, and there's a whole focus on our services creating the conditions for the environment to be, to allow lived experience groups to flourish in the community, and our role is all about extending ourselves into the community. And I think that has a huge impact on addressing stigma.
I think you kind of touched on it there a little bit, but as the National Connecting Communities Lead, how do you envision the role of lived experience evolving within Change Grow Live and the wider recovery sector in the coming years? And I guess what steps need to be taken to ensure its continued impact out there? You've mentioned LEROs being a big part of that.
I think it is about recognising the skills and the assets of people who've lived experience and allowing us to create an environment of trust. I think the common element with all this work we're doing is enabling services to feel that they can trust people who've lived experience to work autonomously. And what do we need to do as a service to provide that space? there's loads of fantastic initiatives going on all over the country, which are really allowing that relationship. And I think the challenge is that each community is different. Each community has different needs, you know. So it's one of the things we always do is look at what the assets are in the community are, and then seeing about how do we connect with that, you know. And then also once you've found out what the assets is, what's missing, you know. What can we help to provide in that community which will support sort of harm reduction.
I think that's recovery. I learned that years ago talking about your work wife Helen. Do you know, we did a piece of work on asset-based community development stuff, which I think at the time was very forward thinking of the organisation, because rather than us looking at everything that we can do as an organisation, like we used to have our own like football team and stuff like that, which is great, all that stuff, but for me there was an element of why are we not, I want to say staff resources, I don't necessarily mean it in a negative way, but why are we putting so much time into things and being introverted with it and doing it under our banner when, hang on, there's a place, a charity up the road that are working with people with lived experience, with mental health issues that we can tap into. So it was like looking at those gaps in the community and trying to fill it with those assets as opposed to let's do everything ourselves. And I think I often say, it sounds a bit cheesy this, but I think as an organisation we're really good at inspiring change and helping people grow, but getting people to live is the different part, getting people to move on from services, because I think some people almost get addicted to the recovery services because they've got so much from it. They constantly want to be around it, coming to all the meetings here, coming to every event here, every function here, everything that we do. And it's like, it's great and you're more than welcome to, but go out there, see what's in the community and live. Find people that you have things in common with, but also the differences. Meet people who aren't just in addiction or aren't in recovery, but can still maybe relate to you and empathise with your story in other ways. Yeah. Because I think that's the strange thing that people can do is get addicted to the recovery service and it becomes so insular, I guess is what I would think.
No, absolutely. And I think that, you know, I think for people who are in sort of building recovery and community brick roles or volunteer leads or service user involvement, you know, all of those people, it's a sort of no-brainer that we should be better linked into the communities. And we can't do everything, you know, and I think there's various reasons for that. And I think it's just how services are commissioned, you know, how
because they're also different across the country.
They're also different, but also, you know, unless you've got, you know, it's like the key performance indicators, the KPIs which every service has to sort of meet. If they're not aligned to sort of recovery or harm reduction, outward facing stuff. There's a lot of emphasis we're just doing the structured stuff. Do you know what I mean? And I think there has been a shift now to saying, actually, a better way to sort of, you know, serve the community is to link it with the environment around, you know. And like you said, there's often lots of groups, a lot of organisations which provide excellent care for people, you know, and I'm always amazed when we go into, you know, another agency or something and they've never heard of us or something, you know what I mean? And it's like, hang on a sec, you know, what are we doing wrong here? How don't they? You know what I mean? And then there's all this. I was in a meeting yesterday and we were talking about this. It's a sort of like, you know, there's all the sort of health providers, all the other small groups of people. You know, the people who come to our services have most of the time got a health issue related to it. You know, people don't generally come in here fit and healthy, but they've got you know, an addiction, you know. So there's so much work we can do to move things into you know, providing those pathways into other care. And I think there's a lot of benefit in that is reducing the stigma, because I think there's a lot of And I think the key antidote to stigma is education, because I think if people understand what's going on for someone, why would you think that of someone? You know what I mean? If you understand why someone's going through it. So I think there's something, say...
Because that's it, going back to the stigma. Someone's homeless on the floor, someone walks past us, I wonder what they did to end up there. Yeah. Well, sometimes they didn't do anything. Absolutely. They're just a product of really shit circumstances that happened around them, and they're a victim of it. Absolutely. But that is where the mentality comes in, is what did they do to get there? Yeah. Which is such a backwards way of thinking, but is almost the default setting. And I know before I started working in substance misuse services, that's what I used to think. Yeah. So when people say it, I don't think, how can you think that? I understand why you think that, because I used to think that way too. Yeah. But when I started to go through the education and listen to people and hear these stories, hear about these traumas, it's part of the reason why this entire podcast series exists, is because of those things. Yeah. It completely changes the way in which you look at things and the way in which your mind works. Yeah. Woody, I'm just going to finish up with 10 questions, completely unrelated to what we've spoken about so far. If you've heard our other podcast, I'm sure you're looking forward to this. Our first question is, what's your favourite word?
Spirituality.
Least favourite word?
Chaos.
Tell me something that excites you, whether that be creatively, spiritually, or emotionally.
My children.
Tell me something that doesn't excite you.
Excel spreadsheets.
Do you have a favourite swear word?
You
don't want to say it, do you? Say it.
I'm finding it really hard.
I can skip that one, don't worry. What sound or noise do you love?
I love a robin singing.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Screeching of metal. Sort of.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Carpenter.
Nice. What profession would you not like to do?
Deep sea diving.
That sounds fun.
But I'm a bit claustrophobic.
Oh, fair enough then, yeah. And lastly, you're a spiritual person, so if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You're here at last.
Brilliant. Woody, thank you so much for joining us on Believe in People.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt.
And if you've enjoyed this episode of the Believe in People podcast, we'd love for you to share it with others who might find it meaningful. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode, and leaving a review will help us reach more people and continue challenging stigma around addiction and recovery. For additional resources, insights and updates, explore the links in this episode description. And to learn more about our mission and hear more incredible stories, you can visit us directly at believeinpeoplepodcast.com.